Raibh maith agat ara go ginearálta cuireann fáilte raibh an bille seo ach táim imníoch faoi rudaí a thurlóg mar gheall air. I welcome this bill in that it will provide for elected public representatives to take part in the rent rate setting in each local authority. This already happens in some areas, but is not laid down in law as of yet. Any system that allows rent levels to be set by a county or city manager without input or influence by elected representatives who are accountable to the people is wrong. Local councillors are probably some of the best placed people to ascertain the reality on the ground in their areas in relation to housing. They know better than many the cost of across the board of private rental of property purchase. They are acutely aware from their local work of the standard of living of the people in the area, of what they can afford, what they need and where they need it. This is the job of the local representative, and this bill will allow councillors to do that job and allow the people to hold decision makers to account. But it is unfortunate that we have waited so long for a housing bill in this government's lifetime. Over 2 years now, this bill is a good step, but it leaves many important issues to be dealt with on the horizon in 2 other planned housing bills, which I fear will be similarly narrow. Housing remains a major problem in this state, a problem which this government has failed to tackle, thus allowing the need to grow, rents to rise, conditions to deteriorate, and savvy landlords to make profits in the absence of public provision. This government has failed tenants, homeowners and those seeking a home, and this bill will do nothing to change that. I'm tired of telling you, Minister, I know that you know these facts, and I do believe you want to address them, but this government as a whole, your department, has no desire to do any such thing. I'm tired of reciting that housing need is now at its highest since the foundation of the state, that there are applicants years on the waiting lists. But when it seems that this figure is not changing or ever increasing, then it must be recited. It must be said wherever this government goes, it must be a millstone around your necks that we cannot let you forget. It must be this way because something can be done, but honestly nothing is being done. It is not a new policy, but it is being happily pursued by this government. The further depletion of the public housing stock, the overburdening of the voluntary sector, and the drive to subsidise private landlords and developers to provide often below standard housing at a very high price is still continuing. This government continues to spend over £500 million a year on rent supplement and RAS. This is tantamount to an admission of failure. Instead of building homes and collecting rent, the state funnels huge sums of public money into private hands to provide unsustainable and insecure housing. What has the government done to cut this bill? It is certainly not to provide real public housing. Instead, Minister Borton, who thankfully only has her hands on rent supplement for a limited time into the future, attempted to use rent supplement recipients as a tool to beat down rents and reduce costs. This failed and failed miserably, not just in reducing rents, but it also left many families in very precarious situations and put some on the street and some homeless. Where once the state provided at least some form of housing, now they are pushing families out of homes because adequate housing is not cost effective in a housing support system. Focus Ireland reported earlier this year that this was the result, but nothing has changed. Now the rent supplements recipients are pursued to reduce their rent below market norms as rents are on the increase. In 2012, there were 4 times less homes available for rent in Dublin than in 2009. Dublin rents between 2012 and 2010 rose by 6%. That rate continues today in figures released by daft.ie. Rents are only likely to increase as rental properties are scarce and getting scarcer. This is the result of housing support over housing provision, because housing support is not about supporting a housing system of the people who need housing. It is about shirking the government's responsibility and subsidising landlords. That is blatantly obvious for anyone to see. Yesterday, the government tabled a bill which will see an increase in repossessions, with nearly 50,000 buy-to-let mortgages in distress. This will have massive repercussions on the rental market and rent prices. Landlords who survive will be able to charge even more extortionate rents for flats which are below par. I've dealt with so many families recently who face eviction when the banks roll in and take control of the home they rent. They paid their rent, they kept their side of the bargain, but now with the bank's desire to sell on the property for a quick buck, or simply its unwillingness to act as a landlord, these families face being left homeless. The worst of all this is that many of these rents are being subsidised by the public purse. Landlords are being paid and they are not using that money to secure the home of these families. This is another disgrace. People on rent supplement and RAS are from low income brackets and in no position to up and leave their homes and go searching for new accommodation at a time when rent prices are spiralling. Increasingly, we are seeing landlords advertise that rent supplement will not be accepted. Anyone going online has experienced and seen for themselves this same message. I've raised this in here and I'm blue in the face raising it. I've called for a code of conduct to set up with the banks and lending institutions to protect tenants. Sinn Féin has called for a closer control of the rent supplement system to ensure that the best deal is got for the public purse and tenancies are managed and secured. None of these recommendations, these pleas have been listened to. RAS, sold as a great step for people stuck in rent supplements poverty trap, was seen as a positive move. People who signed up could work and were guaranteed that they would be housed. Now I am dealing with families in RAS who face eviction by banks, some of which the state own. And because no social housing is being built, the local authority cannot live up to its side of the bargain. These families sit at home waiting for the knock at the door to throw them out. This is not news to you, Minister, or your department. But the problem does not just lie in provision. Housing standards have been allowed to slip or continue to be very poor, especially in large urban centres. A recent blitz of inspections by Dublin City Council found that 90% of flats in certain parts of Dublin did not meet the most basic standards. The figures make for very disturbing reading, despite my being aware that conditions of housing on the bottom rung are very poor. The headline of it all is that Dublin, and it is certainly not alone in this regard, is going back to the days of the slum and the slum landlord. This is not 1913. In this day and age, these conditions are not acceptable. But when we tell people that their rent is too high to continue supplementing, then we are saying, go to the slums. That is all we will support. People don't choose to live in slums. They live there because there is nothing else. This government has provided nothing else. With this in mind, is it particularly scandalous that the PRTB, which the government sees fit to expand the responsibilities of, received no state funding and has had to cut staff and outsource services? All this government has done is to give some mealy-mouthed commitments and provide little as to how they will be achieved. Local authorities will also have greater powers to move on shared ownership agreements. We already have a continuing flow of seizures in this area. The proposed solutions are rehashes of failed policies. I've mentioned above, NAMA housing will not be used for social housing with the local authorities, but instead given to voluntary housing bodies on leasing arrangements. The ever-increasing role of voluntary housing groups in delivering housing needs at the expense of local authorities is a worrying trend. There is no doubt that voluntary housing groups do a magnificent job, and it's welcome. But it shouldn't be at the expense of local authorities, who traditionally done a great job in delivering and managing social housing. It is also infuriating that these lease agreements, which last 10, 15 or 20 years, and at the end of them, properties will return to developers. So far, we've only seen a few hundred homes delivered, and for a limited period of time. The state cannot get away from this fact. The private sector doesn't want to and cannot provide the housing needed by the 98,000 people on the housing waiting list. It is failing to provide proper housing for many of the 94,000 people on rent supplement, and even the 24,000 people on RAS are insecure as buy-to-let mortgages are under greater threat with the move by the government to close a loophole preventing many repossessions. Sinn Féin has proposed measures to implement a major house building initiative which would see the beginning of construction of 9,000 new homes over the next 2 years, creating employment, reducing rents and getting people off waiting lists. We have called for the local authorities to be empowered to negotiate rent supplement and RAS rates, and for the government to put some appropriate NAMA housing into permanent public ownership. These would not solve the crisis overnight, but they would be a start and would show that this government is serious about providing housing and its aims to end homelessness. Landlords are increasingly playing hardball with tenants and are resisting rent supplement cuts. People are panicking and frantically searching for new places to live at lower rates set by the Department of Social Protection. The special purpose vehicle set up within NAMA to deliver social housing through leasing initiatives for local authorities and voluntary housing bodies seems to be on a go slow, and this is not good enough. Minister, Section 62 of the Housing Bill, which you mentioned earlier, and you are going to reform Section 62. There is an urgent need to do that. There is many families and many local authorities are worried about some of the families that are causing serious antisocial problems. And this needs to be addressed. The Supreme Court rulings in this and the European Court's reaction to this needs to be urgently addressed. I also welcome that you've removed Section 6 of Section 31, or subsection 6 of Section 31 of the Household of the Act, because local authorities used. It was always traditional that the means within the house would be the way it would be judged. What money was coming into a house, whether people were working or otherwise, and what was coming into the house. And I wouldn't like to see anything else included. So I just welcome that you are saying that. I know there's 2 further bills to come. And these bills are very important. This area has become such a huge problem area and is getting worse. And I do, Minister, worry why. And I don't know what your position was in terms of the property tax. Did you fight to stop this being put on local authorities? Because it's inevitably going to go onto their rent in some way. It's going to, and I feel that it was traditional that local authority housing was not touched, and I would once again appeal that we should seek to do that in the future. We also have thousands of homes that are at risk over pyrite, and we are only seeing the beginnings of this, and the Minister has said he's going to he's brought in a number of measures to try and tackle this. We need to move those measures forward quickly to deal with these houses. And I'm also worried about the Priory Hall residents, and this is an example of where housing turned into an absolute disaster. These residents are still not sorted out. It's in the courts, accept that, but this really needs to be addressed, and pressure needs to be applied. It is, in my opinion, a good idea to move on to the time on record with all the local authorities. And I just always felt that the process where we use points and other local authorities use other mechanisms, I think it needs to be standardised, and I agree with you on this. It needs to be standardised, but I think we should move quickly. I have people 10, 15, 20 years on the housing waiting list and going nowhere. I think it's just terrible, and some people have come in ahead of them and managed to get get housing before them. It's an absolute scandal. So I do think that we need to move in that direction. The local authorities, you have made it clear that the local authorities will be taking over the rental supplement. I think it is probably better that it is handled by the local authorities, because the whole housing issue needs to be handled from the one body. Well, it should be certainly handled by local authorities when it comes to rental supplement. I think that's very, very important. And I'd like to know when this is going to happen. I know we've been promised by the Minister in the past that this was going to happen, but some idea when this will change. I think originally she said 2014, so I think that's important that that moves on. Well, I support this bill in principle. You know, the loophole that this closes could cause us problems, as I said. It could open a Pandora box in terms of the effects it could have in an increase in repossessions. And I do think we need to look at that very carefully. And as I said, we do need to have rules and regulation, and we should be talking to all the lending institutions on a code of practice. I believe this is extremely important, that we should have a code of practice to deal with this, because I've spoken to Ulster Bank and other institutions, and I was very unhappy with the, with what they had said in regards to some of these. And Minister, I do think that we do need to talk further to these lending institutions, and not to be moving, if a loophole is closed here, not to use that as an excuse. And this applies to the local authorities too, in terms of shared ownership. It could technically allow the local authorities more scope to repossess, and I'd be worried about that would speed that up, because anything pre-2009 is going to be a problem. Well, I welcome this bill, and I certainly think that this has to be tightened up. But I'm looking forward now to seeing what the other two bills, which are a bit down the road. It's a pity they're not coming sooner, because the crisis is getting worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy.